Hey everyone, today's video is the second in a series on the classes of Diablo 4. In each video, we'll look at the strengths, weaknesses, skills, class-specific mechanics, and different builds for each class, and even rank their builds based on their strength in the endgame to help you decide if this is the class you want to play. And up next is the Necromancer. Starting with strengths, Necromancer is the only class that can command a massive number of summons, allowing him a huge presence on the battlefield. And while the Necromancer himself isn't the most tanky class in the game, his undead army is. With powerful skills that make his summons able to take a serious beating, the Necromancer's army in Diablo 4 is a very tough meat shield, which helps keep the Necromancer safe from damage. Necromancer also has access to some of the highest damage output spells in the game, like Bone Splinters, Bone Spear, Bone Spirit, and Bone Storm, making Bone Necro one of the strongest builds currently, if not the strongest, which we'll talk about later. Now, when it comes to weaknesses, the Necromancer in Diablo 4 is like the Necromancer in Diablo 2 in that you need to raise skeletons from corpses. They don't just appear once you select the skill like they do in Diablo 3. So it could take some time to build up your summoned army, and in that time you can be vulnerable. Necromancers also have pretty bad mobility compared to other classes. Their only skill to increase their move speed is a 15% increased move speed anytime they deal damage with a darkness skill through Reaper's Pursuit. It's better than the Druid's mobility since it's more move speed and only costs 3 skill points instead of 4, but it doesn't compare to the other classes, and you still need to use a darkness skill consistently in order to keep that move speed. Alright, let's talk about skills. Necromancers have 6 skill groups: Basic, Core, Macabre, Corruption, Summoning, and Ultimate. Each tier is unlocked after a certain level is reached. For example, Core skills are unlocked at level 3, Macabre at 7, Corruption at 12, Summoning at 17, and Ultimate at 24, so you will be able to test out the Necromancer Ultimate abilities in the upcoming open beta. Unlike how Druids can't start as Summoners, Necromancers actually can because of their class-specific mechanic called the Book of the Dead, which gives them access to their summons, and we'll get into in the next section. But before that, if you're enjoying this video, make the Necromancer smile by clicking like and subscribe. Alright, moving on to class-specific mechanics. The Necromancer will be the only class with the Book of the Dead, a book that lets you customize your skeletal warriors, mages, and golem with a large number of different options for each. Skeletal warriors can either be skeletal skirmishers, defenders, or reapers. The skirmishers wield a sword and deal increased damage with reduced life. The defenders are shield bearers with increased life, and the reapers deal heavy damage with slow attack speed. Depending on which you select, they each have unique upgrades. For example, Reapers can generate corpses with their attacks, Defenders can completely negate damage they would have taken, and Skirmishers can cause your attacks to critically strike more often. And what's great is that you can also opt to not have Skeletal Warriors and choose from a number of different buffs instead, like increased critical strike chance, non-physical damage resistance, or increased shadow damage. Skeletal Mages and the Golem have the exact same format. 3 different varieties, 2 customization options, and then a sacrifice buff if you choose to not be able to summon the minion. Skeletal mages can be shadow mages, which deal shadow damage, cold mages, which chill and eventually freeze enemies, which could be quite good, or bone mages, which use their own bones as projectiles, dealing heavy damage at the cost of life. Your golem can be a bone golem, which uses an AoE taunt, a blood golem, which drains life from nearby enemies, very awesome, or the iron golem, which does an AoE ground slam, which stuns enemies. Now, the upgrades for each of these different minions vary in terms of strength. One of the most powerful, in my opinion, is actually the blood golem, which can be upgraded to absorb 15% of the damage you would take. Now, this is huge. This is basically a 15% damage reduction for you passively all the time. And then don't forget that blood golem also drains life from nearby enemies, so it's constantly getting life back, and so you're constantly getting this amazing damage reduction just by having this blood golem out. This is one of my favorites. There's also some other upgrades, like for the bone golem, each time your golem takes up to 20% of its maximum life as damage, it sheds a corpse, so that's helpful if you're playing it like a corpse-based build. You can also give it 10% maximum life and increase its thorns that it inherits from you from 30 to 50%. This can be very good because bone golem actually taunts your enemies in a wide area, and if you boost its health and thorns, that could be a way to deal more damage as well. Then the iron golem, which slams and stuns enemies, it can make it so that when they slam the enemies and they get stunned. They also are vulnerable for 3 seconds, and vulnerable in Diablo 4 increases the amount of damage that enemies or you will take when you're vulnerable. So there's a number of upgrades for both golems, mages, and warriors to choose from. Now overall, as a class mechanic, I feel like it really captures the Necromancer class fantasy, and I like how you can sacrifice having minions for increasing your own power. Okay, moving on to builds. Now the main themes are Bone, which utilizes bone abilities like Bone Prison, Bone Spear, and Bone Spirit. Darkness, which uses abilities like Reap, Sever, and Blight. Summons, like Skeletal Warrior, Skeletal Mage, and Golem, and finally Blood, which uses skills like Blood Mist, Blood Lance, and Hemorrhage. Now when it comes to endgame, the best endgame builds are number 1, Bone Necromancer. Bone Necromancer deals huge amounts of physical damage through a number of powerful bone abilities. The main damage dealing skills being Bone Spear, Bone Spirit, and the ultimate, Bone Storm. Now Bone Storm does 180% damage over 10 seconds, but you don't just summon it around you. You also summon a second Bone Storm around your golem, effectively doubling its effectiveness. It can also be upgraded through Supreme Bone Storm, which is a skill, to double its duration to 20 seconds. Its total cooldown is 60 seconds, but through the skill Rapid Ossification, every 100 essence you spend reduces the cooldown of all bone skills by 1.5 seconds, which lets this ability get off cooldown pretty fast. Of course, this build runs with a golem, a blood golem in particular, because it can actually absorb 15% of all damage you would take, which aids a lot with the Necromancer's survivability, and because Bone Storm is twice as strong when you have your golem out, so it fits perfectly. This build opts to sacrifice both skeletal warriors and mages for the sacrifice effects, and finally the capstone ability, Ossified Essence, gives your bone skills 1% more damage per point of essence you have above 50 upon cast, which can be a lot of bonus damage. Overall, this build has incredibly high AoE damage. It's got great survivability and really ranks as one of the top builds even across all classes as of the closed beta test. It does absolutely amazing AoE. So Bone Necro is the top build, and actually based on what I've read and talked to people, that is actually the only viable endgame build that Necromancers could use to clear all content, even the highest tiered nightmare dungeons. Darkness, Blood, and Summons, unfortunately, were not viable endgame. When it comes to minions, they are extremely good meat shields, and they could even survive in the endgame, but they just didn't have the damage nor AoE clearing ability that Bone does. Ultimately, players found that the only summon worth keeping as a Necromancer was the Golem because of its amazing ability to absorb 15% of all damage you would take. It actually kind of reminds me of Soul Link in WoW as a Warlock. It's just really strong. Now keep in mind though, all of this was based on data available from the closed beta test, information online, and there will most likely be changes before the final game releases. I'm hoping there will be lots of different builds that Necromancers could go that will be very viable in the endgame other than Bone Necro, but right now that is the absolute strongest. Anyways, that's all for this video, guys. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that like button, and you might like the video shown on the screen. I'll see you there.